I entered the corporate world and suddenly was faced with traumatic situations in that world, toxic bosses, toxic environments. So I would switch jobs and switch companies, and then I was finding out it was the same.
It's a behavior as a manager that tends to be traumatic for your direct reports. It gets you rewarded for a while, and then it absolutely becomes an Achilles heel.
Perfectionism is an outgrowth of needing to be in control, which can start from childhood trauma, from trauma in other organizations with other bosses. It's a need to feel in control, and it really has the opposite effect.
I see a lot of people who are perfectionists because the quality of the work matters so much to them. They're afraid they have had bad experiences with turning it over to somebody and the quality suffers. And then they'll up the ante on the quality and on and on and on we go, so they make it an impossible task. But I've also seen people who have been rewarded for being perfectionist. And then they find it a really hard habit to break. They feel like that's the thing that is going to continue to get them rewarded.
Many times it's cultural, and actually, depending on how deep it runs, this is where
there is no growth in comfort and no comfort in growth. Yet the big leaps are how careers are made and how businesses excel. So how do you master not knowing at all or feeling like an imposter? How do you have the conversations that lead to trust and, of course, excellence? How do you take charge of the things that you can control? How do you thrive outside your comfort zone? That's what this podcast is about. I'm your host, Wanda Wallace, and it's time to get out of your comfort zone. Welcome to the conversation. Far too often, I find that work is overly demanding, unrelenting, and a source of far too much stress. Now, all you need to do is to add to that already difficult cocktail a negative experience with a manager or a coworker, and you start to get a bunch of microtraumas that can begin to add up, like microstressors, and eventually depleting your capacity to lead and your ability to thrive. So the question for today is, how do we deal with these microtraumas? Why are they impacting our leadership? How does that work, and what do we do about it? And that's what we're going to talk about. How do you get back to thriving as a leader? So my guest today is Monique Daigneault. She's the president and CEO of MD Consulting and host of the Voice America podcast, Leading with Intention. She's a trained coach, an accredited master coach with thousands of coaching hours with corporate executives on all 6 continents, 15 industries. Monique is a survivor of childhood trauma and workplace microtrauma and has complex PTSD. So from a personal point of view, she really understands how this all plays out. And it's been her mission to shift behavior in the workplace and empower leaders to be more impactful and influential. And the book we're talking about is the Survive and Thrive Toolkit for Leaders. So Monique, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Wanda. It is great to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. It's interesting to me that we're talking so much about stress and about stress levels and about burnout. I think that's been going since 2019. But the increased levels of report of burnout around the world are a little staggering. I have to tell you, every time I look at that data, it's kind of shocking. So we've talked about stressors, we talked about microstressors, but now we're talking about microtrauma. So tell me what you're seeing with microtrauma.
What I'm seeing in the workplace from the people that I coach are sometimes even subtle forms of behavior from their managers. And that could be managers that withhold feedback. So a person never really knows where they're at with the expectations, or a manager that says, don't worry, if something's wrong, I'll tell you. Otherwise, just business as usual. But that still leaves a person wondering, and sometimes unsure of making decisions or what way to handle their own team, because they feel a little bit like they're walking on eggshells. Or more overt forms of trauma like bullying or verbal harassment or subtle threats to a person's job without any real validation or anything to back that up. So that's causing a lot of anxiety in the workplace that adds to someone who's already stressed out and maybe burned out.
Right, right. I see that in my clients as well, coming and going. So you have a manager that maybe you used to have a manager you were really close to, and then suddenly you have a new manager and you're not so close to them, and they're not exactly your style, and it's hard to figure out how to communicate with them, and they're not very forthcoming on feedback, and you just kind of don't know where you stand. And add to that a coworker who's not performing, or a team member who's, these things, they just pile up and you start feeling like incredibly vulnerable. All right, now you talk about your own set of trauma, so both your childhood trauma as well as the trauma you experience in the workplace. Tell us just a tiny little bit about that and how that showed up for you.
Well, I come from a childhood of trauma, and I entered the corporate world when I was 22 and hadn't yet even worked on my own personal trauma. So I entered the corporate world and suddenly was faced with traumatic situations in that world. Bosses who shouldn't be leading, toxic bosses, toxic environments. So I was re-traumatized and had to figure out how to navigate that. And I first thought it was maybe that particular job or that particular company that wasn't a fit for me. So I would switch jobs and switch companies, and then I was finding out it was the same. So then I realized it was a trend in many companies, and this was decades ago. And I also realized then that I had to start working on my own trauma and dealing with that and trying to identify my triggers. Because I had been traumatized as a child, the triggers in the workplace were reminders, unconscious reminders to me. So that's when I realized that it really starts with yourself. You've got to heal yourself from past trauma, from workplace trauma. You have to start to identify all the triggers and figure out how you can improve your own behavior, because quite frankly, you can't improve the behavior of somebody else. And that's a little bit of a misnomer, because many of my clients say, well, this boss is toxic. What do I do about the boss? How do I make the boss change? How do I make the boss give me feedback if I want it? And things like that. So you really have to you can only control your own behavior. So that's the angle that I take when I work with my clients. And the whole concept of my book is based on first heal yourself, and then you're in a better position to navigate these toxic environments.
Right. I would love to say, send me all your toxic managers. We have a magic pill. We'll fix it. And certainly if they're willing to look at their own behavior, we'd encourage that. But in the meantime, I don't like leaving people waiting so either you have two choices. I just wait it out and keep suffering, or I leave and go find another job. And there is a third choice, which is learn to have it be less traumatic for you personally. That sounds a little antithetical, but I have seen it work, and it's possible. And that's your experience as well. So I know I'm interested in other kinds of trauma stories that you get. I know I worked with a woman a number of years ago who was literally not doing what she needed to do to impress her boss and win her boss over, and was on the cusp of getting fired. And what was peculiar is this had nothing to do with capability. It was just absolutely kind of frozen, incapable of thinking about what to do and how to do it. When finally sort of got this all unpacked, I was like, wait a minute, you know how to do what we just worked through. What's happened here? And for her, it was a reminder of a prior experience 3 years ago where she was treated horribly by the team and ultimately fired. And she was just frozen for fear that it was going to happen again. That's the same kind of stuff you're talking about with the microtraumas.
Yes, and I have many clients in sessions refer to this as, I have PTSD from my past employer. This is what they did. This is how they did it. And yes, they've carried that over into their current job. And in coaching, we've got to separate that. We've got to help them separate it and look for validation. Like, how do you know this is from this boss? And in that way, it kind of retrains their brain to separate the experiences so that they can function a little bit better.
Right. That makes sense to me. And that is certainly what I have seen work. Do you have any other examples of the kind of micro traumas that you've seen and how it has impacted people's leadership?
Well, I had a client who, the way they explained it to me was that their boss was giving them what we would call the cold shoulder. Mm-hmm. It was just kind of this wall was up between the two of them. And no matter how my client tried to communicate or be friendly or ask questions or show empathy, the boss would really just literally give them a cold shoulder, and they didn't know what they did wrong. They weren't being told what they did wrong, but it was causing them to feel like they were walking on eggshells every time they got around this person. And they were so nervous and so anxious. And then they weren't sure, well, was it a decision I made that maybe I need to be more careful in how I make decisions? They didn't know, they weren't being told, they weren't being given any feedback. And it literally does have people freeze up because they're afraid to make a move. And it's really, really unsettling. This person was even having insomnia from it and trouble at home and irritability at work. It all really spiraled.
Right. I've seen people who have ended up in the hospital with heart problems. I've seen insomnia. I've seen, disruption at home. I've seen a whole bunch of things. I've seen people taking it out on their teams and starting to yell in ways that are not sort of their typical behavior. We do crazy stuff, or not normal stuff, I should say, when we're feeling these micro traumas. All right, so let's shift then and talk about the healing process. And I love your approach, Monique, that you say, I want to give individuals the tools to know how to heal themselves a bit so that we can separate what is the prior trauma and what's the real situation, and then what are my degrees of freedom and what can I do in the current situation. So describe to me what that healing process looks like in your view.
What I've written about in my book is that it's critical for people to start with their own healing. So I give my clients a tool, if it resonates with them, related to the 8 dimensions of wellness. So this is a tool that covers all areas of their life, and we go through each area to see what is being impacted by the trauma that they're experiencing. And this involves some reflection, some journaling, some unpacking and coaching. And with that tool, we determine where their gaps are, what areas of their life are functioning optimally and what areas are not. So many times in the workplace, that is one of the dimensions of wellness, occupational wellness. So many times we find deficiencies in that area. And then we take it one step further and identify the exact gaps, meaning what are the behaviors? Are you having anxiety? Are you not managing your team like you think you should? So we start unpacking that and come up with goals that we set. And then I present to them another tool that is specifically for goals, where we identify the goals, we identify the ideal outcome of what they want, and then how are we going to measure that, and then what are the steps that they need to take to get to that point. So it's a 3-pronged process once we identify the goal. And then in coaching, we put action plans together to keep them moving forward on that. And we have checks and balances, and there's the accountability that comes along with coaching.
Okay, so what are the 8 areas then?
The first area, and they're not necessarily in this order because it just really depends on how a person looks at this tool, but spiritual, emotional, social, financial, relationship, occupational, physical, and intellectual. And what we find in the workplace where microtrauma is concerned, that many times several of these areas are hit by the microtrauma. Physical, I mean, you mentioned that you've had people in the hospital because of this. So physical, occupational, relationship, that area can be impacted, the work relationships as well as the personal relationships. So once we use this tool and try to dig into all these areas, people really start to see how the workplace behavior has impacted them in many areas. Initially, they have blinders on. They know that it's impacting them at work, but they don't really realize how far this has spanned into their life.
So can you give me an example of somebody you've worked with and where the gaps, so like how did this unfold in their lives and where were the gaps?
So with one client, we used this tool, and she was telling me that she had problems gaining weight. She was gaining weight. She didn't tie it in, though, to the stress that she was experiencing at work. So as she used this tool, we found many areas that were deficient, but the physical area was a huge aha moment for her, because she realized then that she was doing emotional eating from the stress. And even though as coaches we are not therapists and we can't dig into all of these and we're not physicians, what we did identify was that, all right, one of her areas of wellness was physical wellness. It was being impacted at work, and she had gained more weight than what her doctor felt she should have. So her goal was to lose 20 pounds. That was the goal for that dimension of wellness, and that was validated and agreed upon by her doctor. So that became the goal, and the measurements are the ways that we defined how we would know if she met that goal. So again, in conjunction with her doctor, she determined that we would know if she was successful at this by her scale weight going down, but also her body fat composition dropping, and then her blood work was really important. So those were the measurements. And then together we worked on the steps that she needed to take to accomplish that. So she had decided to carve out time for herself, because that's one of the things she wasn't doing because she was so stressed about work. She had no self-care. So she hired a personal trainer. That was one step. She set up a time to go to a gym for a certain amount of time. So that was another step. And then she was going to create a support system for herself with a couple of girlfriends who could work out with her as kind of accountability partners. So those were the steps that she took. And then her body fat and her weight and her blood work were done on a routine basis, depending on what her doctor wanted. And so we could measure her progress along the way. And what she found out as she started to achieve these goals is that it positively impacted another area of wellness for her, which was emotional, because her mood got better, she was eating better, she was sleeping better. So it had a widespread impact on the other areas of her life, including relationships and things like that. So this was something where in her mind at first it had nothing to do with work. And so she never put any of these things in place because she didn't understand how it tied in. And then once she used the tool, she realized that her physical wellness definitely was under her control. She didn't have to depend on a boss or anybody else to do that for her, and that it really increased her self-esteem and her confidence. So she was able to face the situations at work with a little more stability and groundedness.
Okay. I was going to say, how did this ultimately impact the relationship with her boss? Did it even improve it?
Well, we found some other areas in that 8 dimensions of wellness that she worked on, specifically the occupational area. But with some of the other things we put in place was her communication, her way of showing up in the meetings with her boss. And when her physical wellness had improved and her confidence had improved and she started feeling better about herself, she felt more confident about having a voice and being able to reduce her anxiety and her nervousness when she was in front of her boss.
Right. I have certainly seen that when somebody reduces or increases their confidence and they reduce their own nervousness tendencies, whatever those look like for anybody, that the boss responds in a calmer way. That there is, it's easier, you don't avoid this person because you're not worried about what's going to happen in front of them. And so they calm down, the boss calms down, that reinforces the person to do things, continue to do them better. And it just becomes this incredibly self-reinforcing cycle that without even a confrontation can move a relationship in a more positive direction. And that's what you're describing here as well.
Yes, I think we put out this energy, if that's your belief and your philosophy, and people sense the way we show up. And if we're showing up anxious, scared, worried, we're putting that out. They're picking up on that in our own demeanor. So it does wonders to do things to increase your confidence and your self-esteem.
Absolutely, totally. All right, so the 8 dimensions, I'm taking a look at the spiritual wellness, the emotional wellness, the social wellness, the financial wellness, the relationship wellness, the occupational wellness, the physical wellness, and the intellectual wellness.
Yes.
Okay. And do you have specific questions, or can anybody take this framework and go away and do a little bit of reflecting for themselves and say, where am I really experiencing a gap?
Yes, the framework is very self-explanatory because the 8 dimensions are laid out in the framework. I think where people get a little confused is many of us are great at setting goals and saying what we want the outcome to be, but then we don't get tactical and we don't determine the steps that we need to take to get there. And that's when a coach comes in handy because we can help people through that. So the tool is laid out for that, for them to be able to outline their steps. I think people tend to neglect that part because then they say, well, what steps? I don't understand what steps. But in my book, it does go through a description of how you can help yourself to create those steps.
Right. I think exactly as you did in your example, the sort of saying, how are we going to measure success? Putting that in, even if it's a behavioral thing, like I want to improve my relationship, you can still put in measures that say, how do I tell if I've improved the relationship? The person speaks to me more often. They smile more often when they see me. We go out for a coffee once every now and then. You can put measures in that are indicators of every goal. And I find in my coaching that when people have a measure, then they work themselves backwards to say, what do I need to do to affect that measure?
Yes, the measurements are really, really important because if you do set a goal and you're just verbalizing the goal, that's great, you have the goal, but you need to know how you're going to gauge your progress.
Right, absolutely. And there's nothing like telling somebody that you're going to do these steps and meeting them again in a week or 2 weeks or a month later where they're going to ask, how are you doing, to keep that accountability on. It really does work wonders for all of us. All right, how do you help clients stay on track? Because you just want to get asked this all the time. I've got a goal, I got a set of actions. How do I make sure I keep up with it?
Well, my sessions always begin with a debrief of the person's action items that they agreed on in the previous session. So the sessions always end with an agreement as to what steps they're going to take before I see them again, what actions, what are they going to do that keeps them on their plan. And then the sessions begin with a debrief. So that's the accountability part for them, is that they know they're going to have to tell me how they did. And of course, life comes up where sometimes they can't do their action items. And we talk through that. But if they didn't do their action items because they're truly stuck, then they're coached on that, how to get unstuck. So really, it's the debrief in the beginning of the session. And many clients have told me that I hold their feet to the fire. I'm going to take that as a compliment. They know that we're going to be talking about it when they come to a session. So they try usually to do their best between sessions to move forward on what we talked about. After a session, when they agree to their actions, I send back a message to them listing those actions so that they see it in writing. I see it to help me remember what they said they would do. So with all of that, I think that helps when they're in coaching. Now, there are many people who aren't working with a coach for various reasons. And to those people, I would say, just like my client did who was working on her physical wellness, find an accountability person, an accountability partner. Tell somebody you're wanting to work on this so that they can help hold you accountable. Ask them to hold you accountable. There's other people that can do this in a person's life. So if you're serious about something, there's other ways to hold yourself accountable and accomplish it.
Yeah. I find also just a regular review, like a weekly review. How did I do this week against this goal or against this set of action items or against this measurement even? How did I do? And give yourself a rating scale, a 3-point, a 2-point, a 5-point, I don't care, but just that constant discipline of reviewing keeps it top of mind a bit. Okay, so what I like about this approach, Monique, is the systematic. So first off, the recognition that microtrauma and microstress are a real thing. Each event may feel small, but the cumulative experience of them really does have a heavy impact, and it impacts us in ways we may not understand. So I like that you have a framework for looking at where's the impact. So here are the 8 dimensions. Again, they're the spiritual, emotional, social, financial, relational, occupational, physical, and intellectual. Look at these 8 dimensions. Tell me where you're not where you want to be, kind of some reflection and some evaluation and so on. And then say, what are the gaps and what are the behaviors, the action plans we're going to put in place to begin to improve that? And that by just elevating that part for yourself, you create a more positive self-image, more confidence that is likely to have an impact on some other pieces at work that are going to be good constructively. All right, so I want to talk about a couple of classic responses and get your take on what you think is driving it. So one of the ones that I get I see it all the time, perfectionism. It's a behavior as a manager that tends to be traumatic for your direct reports. It gets you rewarded for a while, and then it absolutely becomes an Achilles heel. What's your perspective on this perfectionism and how to begin to heal from that?
What I've seen is that perfectionism is an outgrowth of control, needing to be in control, which can start from childhood trauma, from trauma in other organizations with other bosses. It's a need to feel in control, and it really has the opposite effect. So yes, perfectionism, and it can show up in a number of ways. It can show up as someone micromanaging, being a micromanager, being afraid to delegate. So thinking that you've got to take everything on and you've got to accomplish it all. It's completely up to you. So it can show up in these ways. And in my sessions, when someone self-identifies as a perfectionist, or when we see it, we try to break down what are the behaviors that are going along with that. Are they not delegating? Are they micromanaging? Have they been told they're micromanaging? So then once we've unpacked that part of it, we start to deal with the behaviors. So an example would be if someone cannot delegate, and I ask them, why is that? They'll usually say something like, well, I don't trust my team. I can't give them anything. They're just not going to do it right. It's not going to be done the way I want it done. Or they'll say, I tried this in the past, delegating to someone, and they dropped the ball. And then my head rolled. So we look at this as going forward, okay, those might have been things that happened in the past, but now going forward, what are we going to do about that? So if it's an issue with delegating, I give them another framework, which is also in my book, where they practice delegating, because you can only change a behavior if you practice changing the behavior. Talking about it or thinking about it is good, but you actually have to take steps to change it. So we have them practice with a very small thing that they want to delegate, so that it doesn't feel too scary or too risky. And then I have them pick a person on their team that they want to delegate this to. And already I can tell when I say that to them, the anxiety is starting to build. Okay, I actually have to pick a person. And then we craft a conversation that they'll have with this person to help the person understand how to delegate. And I think many times when something gets delegated, it's just delegated incorrectly. There's no boundaries set, there's no expectations, there's no deadlines. It's sort of just handed off to someone. Well, no wonder it doesn't get done right. So it's a shift in their mindset where, no, you're not just going to toss this work to someone. It's going to be a conversation. You're going to explain your expectations. You're going to, if there's a deadline date, you tell them. You're going to ask for regular check-ins so you know how it's going along the way. And those little steps start to help them feel better, because they are like, oh, there's a check-in. Okay, so I don't have to wait until the due date, realize it's wrong, and then have to fix it, because I'll know earlier if it's not going well. So we practice crafting the conversation, and then their action item is to go have the conversation and do the actual delegating. And then they come back and they're usually so relieved. They'll say things like, wow, that conversation went really well. I was so proud of myself for stating the expectations, and the person on the other end received it very well and went off with the work, and it seems like it will go fine. And then we monitor that along the way, because as you mentioned, the monitoring is really important when you're changing behaviors. So we monitor that. We monitor what happened at the next check-in. Is the project going okay? And does it look like it needs to be tweaked? Does it look like they'll make the deadline? So we start with a small piece of work so that they can practice having the conversation, monitoring everything. And then I don't really let them stop there, because they think they can. Like, oh, that was great, I did it. And I will explain to them, no, now we've got to look at everything that's on your plate and see what else can be delegated. And there's usually a good 5, 10, 15 more things that need to be delegated. And then we put together a plan, or even I have them create a spreadsheet with who on your team can take on which of these things. And when are you going to have the conversations with them? And then we craft all of those conversations. So then it's a much bigger thing than what we started with, but it's helping them in so many ways. They're learning communication skills. They're learning how to set expectations. They are getting things off their plate, which should help alleviate some stress from them. And they should be able then to take on other things that they should be doing, the broader, more strategic things that they have not made time for.
Right, and that their boss is most keen to hear about, and so on. All right, but none of this tackles the fundamental problem, which is the need for control, except that you give them a little bit more control through the expectation setting and the deadlines and the check-ins. But other than that, they still don't have control. So is there a way of tackling that issue, or do you just hope that success will breed to more success?
Well, I don't think they need control. They think they need control, which is what starts the problem. And once they realize that they don't actually need it, it's a false story that they've told themselves from previous trauma it has manifested through, and previous traumatic environments. It's a manifestation of their own anxiety that they've had from these previous traumas and situations. So what I'm giving them is a way to ease that anxiety and to help them shift their mindset to realize that they don't need all that control, that it's causing more anxiety, and that they can be a much better leader by letting go, not by holding on.
It's fascinating. I see a lot of people who are perfectionists because, excuse me, the quality of the work matters so much to them. And they're afraid they have had bad experiences with turning it over to somebody and the quality suffers. And then they'll up the ante on the quality and on and on and on we go, so they make it an impossible task. But I've also seen people who have been rewarded for being perfectionist. Like, that's how you get the best grades. That's how you get the first jobs. That's how you get your early promotions. And then they find it a really hard habit to break. They feel like that's the thing that is going to continue to get them rewarded. So I guess that's its own anxiety. Anxiety, I won't be good enough in some way.
Yeah. And many times it's cultural, depending on that type of a background. And actually, depending on how deep it runs, this is where many of my clients will be working with a therapist along with me as the coach, because some of that runs so deep that in coaching it's out of scope to really address that piece of it. So I think everybody's a little bit different in how they're going to get beyond that.
And the depth of the experience that they've had before and so on. All right, let's talk about another one, my last one for today, which is this whole notion about the fear of promoting yourself, something I hear constantly. I don't want to be obnoxious or be seen to be obnoxious, but ultimately I think there's a fear buried in there. What's your experience?
I think part of the fear is imposter syndrome, is that people don't really believe they have the gifts, the strengths, the skill set to warrant promoting themselves. They don't think they deserve to promote themselves. They think it'll be bragging if they do. And so there's a whole thing around that. But it goes back to they don't think they're good enough to be able to talk about their strengths and to believe themselves, even if they talk about it. So it's related to self-worth. And when I see this in someone, or when they identify it, I help them try to understand their value and the value they've brought to an organization. And we do that by helping them create accomplishment statements. We talk about what they actually have accomplished and where is the proof of that. It goes back to, it's like they have to prove to their brain that they actually did do these things and that there's a metric attached to it. So whether it's how much money they saved the company or how many clients they brought on or anything like that, we talk about the accomplishments, we attach metrics to it, and then I have them go through an added exercise of writing it out, not just talking about it, but writing it. So, and there's a certain way I have them do it, that I have them start with a verb and include the metric in it, and it's preferably one sentence, but 1 to 2 sentences. And I have them go all the way back in their career as far as they can remember and write these accomplishment statements all the way up to the present time in their current role. And I have them put it in a spreadsheet and just start listing. And then I ask them to continue to update it throughout the year. With every accomplishment that they have, it goes in that spreadsheet. And there's more of a method to my madness than just having them write it out. It benefits them in a couple other ways. Those accomplishment statements can go into a resume. So if they're looking for a promotion or looking to change jobs, they've got a list of their accomplishments. They can be used in their mid-year or their year-end performance evaluations. Usually they're asked to do a self-assessment, and they're always confused as to how to write that self-assessment. But now they have lists and lists of accomplishment statements that they can put in that document. And as they do this, I've had people tell me in the middle of the exercise that it was so good for their confidence, that they did not realize how much value they actually brought to an organization until they started writing these out. And it lifts their confidence. And I think behavior underlying has to come from confidence. So if you've got more confidence, your behavior will be different. So that's a little bit about how I help them with the being able to promote themselves. But the other step is then being able to talk about it and weave it into the conversations that they're having in the workplace. And one example that I'll give really quick is if somebody knows that they are really good at organizing and facilitating meetings, and that's just something they're really good at, and we've developed a couple of accomplishment statements around that, and they're in a meeting and their boss is there, and the meeting went really well. They walk out of the meeting and their boss says, "That you really ran that well, organized it, facilitated it, that was great." Instead of saying, "Well, thank you," and leaving it at that, they'll say, "Thank you, that is one of my superpowers. I'm really good at that, so thanks for that feedback." So they just wove into the conversation something that helped promote them. So I work with them in that way also.
I see this when I work with people on brand statements. And, there's a variety of reasons why you need to write a series of brand statements, often around a promotional opportunity where you need to identify something about your leadership and so on. But when you put those proof points beside the statement, so the statement sounds like anybody could say that, and then you start putting the evidence beside it, I find people go, "Oh yeah, that really is true about me." And then it's much more natural to talk about it because I can talk about the proof. I don't have to give the generic statement. Like, I am a great customer service person. Okay. But I can tell you the 5 things I've done in the last year that have made a difference in terms of customer service. Okay, now we've got something that feels more meaningful and feels legitimate.
Right, and I think it feels more authentic to them because a lot of what I hear is, "I don't want to promote myself. It doesn't sound authentic." But it does when you're weaving in your own results that you created.
Yeah. And when you feel it, it is authentic. It's just when you're saying it because you're supposed to that it doesn't feel very authentic. Okay, Monique. For somebody who coaches everybody else about getting out of their comfort zone, I need to know what takes you out of your comfort zone. So what have you been doing lately that pushes you out of your comfort zone?
Well, I have to say my whole journey has been out of my comfort zone, my healing and my work in corporate and all of that. But lately, so I had my book released in July, and that was huge for me. Thank you. That was very much out of my comfort zone, the whole project and making sure it launched and everything. So now I'm working on the second one. There will be a part 2 to that. And that is also pushing me out of my comfort zone. My being a host on the podcast with Voice America was definitely out of my comfort zone. I did not consider myself host material and wasn't really sure when it all started how it would all work out. But that did wonders for me and taught me a lot. And also it was a lot of fun.
Okay. Funny thing about that, isn't it? All right. So how do you keep yourself going when you're out of your comfort zone and it's pretty scary?
I have a lot of really robust spiritual practices to help me stay very grounded. I meditate, I journal, and a lot of that was because of my trauma. I learned those skills to get through my trauma, but I found that it's great self-care. So I have a whole daily routine of various things that I do in the morning and also in the evening to keep me going. And I've learned to really listen to my body and my mind when I need a break, and then I take it. So the self-care part is really important to me.
Self-care part, I love that. So you're actually practicing the tools that you talk about in your book from the 8 dimensions. All right, Monique, what a great conversation. The book, by the way, is called The Survive and Thrive Toolkit for Leaders. And my guest today, Monique Daigneault. And Monique, if people want to find you, where can they go to get you?
My website is mdconsultingglobal.com, and there is a lot of information, complimentary resources. The book can be purchased through there. The podcasts, the blogs are all there.
Fantastic. Thanks for being a guest today. And by the way, we'd love to hear from you. So we have a brand new website for the podcast called outofthecomfortzone.com. Leave us a comment. Tell us any reactions, and we'll get back to you. Thanks very much. Thanks, Monique.
Thank you, Wanda.
It's a pleasure.